This is a panel discussion about Saudi-Emirati relations and the evidence of division between the Saudi and Emirati positions in Yemen that surfaced back in 2018, 2019, when the Southern Transitional Council surged in Aden. But we've also, and this is Noel Brehony is going to take the lead in discussing what is the Emirati view of events in Yemen, as he wrote that chapter in the book. But we asked Abdullah Baabood as well to discuss the Omani view of this issue. Obviously, it raises concerns for the government in Muscat in the wake of this decision, the Riyadh Agreement that welcomed the Southern Transitional Council into the government. So Abdullah, if you could be prepared to speak as well. But Noel, please start us off.
Fine, thank you. Yes, I just want to really start by making the obvious point that how important Saudi Arabia is to the UAE. If you look going back in past, even recent history in the mid 2000s, and also that the war took place less than 3 months after the succession of King Salman and the appointment of MBS as Minister of Defence. A complete change of direction from the rather lackadaisical policies of the Abdullah era. I think MBZ, the UAE, saw this as an opportunity for the UAE to use Saudi power and influence for its aims in the region, and obviously hope to influence Saudi policy. They had a shared concern with Iran, and initially at least a shared concern over the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood of Islam. And clearly there was a very, very good rapport at the beginning, but really the problems have emerged, were, I think, also there from the beginning linked to their own military policies and their roles in Yemen. Clearly, the UAE focuses on the south and the coastal areas, with Saudi Arabia on the main battlefronts, and both pursued the war through supporting Yemeni forces, but in quite different ways. Saudis were really obliged to work with President Hadi, the Yemeni army, and Ali Mohsen in trying to rebuild the army and fight that war, and using sea and air power to support the army. And part of that was because of the influence of Islam. Politically and militarily, inevitably this involved support for Islam. The UAE, on the other hand, in the very early phases, deployed its own forces and then used this experience in other conflicts, mostly in alliance with the US, to identify local forces it could trust, train, pay, equip, and mentor. And this in fact became eventually the security belt forces that proved effective in driving the Houthis out of the south and then taking on AQAP and restoring enough security in Aden to allow the Hadi government to return. Of course, the UAE then went on to Shabwa and Hadramaut, recruiting elite forces, rather different from the STC, but recognizing the special case there. And no doubt mindful of the Islah and Yemeni military influences in northern Hadramaut and Shabwa, and went on to push al-Qaeda out of Maqalla. But the UAE in Aden had found the Hadi regime ineffective. It lacked supports in key parts of the south, was unable to deliver effective government, and for UAE purposes was too close to Islam. I think the UAE more or less foisted Idris al-Zubaydi on al-Hadi as governor of Aden. He proved to be too independent-minded, was sacked, and that eventually led to the creation of the STC, very clearly with UAE support. I mean, I was talking to the STC leaders around this time, and they went to Riyadh where they saw nobody at all, they could see nobody important, and the message they were given was go back and fight the Houthis and come back after it's all over and discuss southern independence. But they went to Abu Dhabi where, of course, they were supported. The UAE from that time onwards, if not before, was paying the expenses of the STC organization. And of course, for quite a long time, was also paying the expenses, the salaries and costs of the security belt and elite forces, and indeed local government officials in parts of the south. The UAE was also responsible for the operations on the west coast and the planned capture of Hodeida. And part of that involved what is now the National Resistance Forces led by Tariq Saleh, which again the UAE trained, paid, and supported from Mocha. I think the real turning point was the decision not to proceed with the attack on Hodeidah, coming just at the time of the Khashoggi problems, and also as the criticism of Saudi Arabia in the West of the way the war was being conducted rose to some crescendo. And there was shortly after that, one saw an apparent warning, perhaps directed towards the UAE, of Iranian influence in unexplained attacks on shipping off the UAE coast. In response to all this, the UAE withdrew most of its forces in 2019, but continued to support the STC and militias. In 2019, the STC rose and took over Aden, and then, of course, tried to move into Shabwa, but were turned back by the Yemeni army. And the UAE attacked the Yemeni army as it was trying to return to Aden, a very clear indication that, of the degree of UAE support for the STC. As a result of the Riyadh Agreement, there's no UAE troops in Aden, and then the Saudis there in small number, and increasingly acting as a sort of mediator, apparently understanding the strength of the STC that they've come to appreciate. This obviously all led to strains between the relationship between MBZ and the MBS, but I think they had enough common interest within the region as a whole, and for the time, the boycott of Qatar and other issues. They were fairly determined not to allow differences between them over Yemen to interfere with that relationship. And there's very clear evidence of friction at working level. Currently, the UAE formally remains part of the coalition. UAE aircraft are still bombing, as far as I know. It apparently supports the Riyadh Agreement, at least it says so. Those actions would suggest otherwise. But just make the point here, which is partly made by Jerry at the end, there's this tends to be an assumption outside that Yemeni clients do what their patrons want. In fact, Yemeni clients demonstrate fairly consistently they do what the Yemeni clients, what their external clients want, remarkably stubborn when their vital interests are at stake. So the UAE is continuing to support the ST financially, and it is certainly mentoring and apparently continuing to provide arms to the security belt and elite forces. It has a limited troops presence, close to about half, Akana in Shabwa, and Makalla, I think for CT purposes, it appears to have a limited presence on the west coast. It seems to be developing an airstrip and other facilities on Periam Island, Mayoun Island, close to Bab al-Mandab. And of course, it's been interested in Soqotra from the outset. I'm never totally clear why. Like it probably sees it as a useful strategic presence for monitoring shipping and naval movements, and perhaps would also want to deny others influence and access there. The UAE was there, but in effect has facilitated the STC takeover of Ireland. There's a small Saudi group presence, but again, they seem to act more like a referee or mediator than an attempt to influence or control. The current military role of the UAE seems to be consistent with a strategy that suggests that the UAE wants to influence political, military, and potentially commercial developments along the coastal regions, using its clients, the STC, and potentially the Northern Resistance Forces, and part of that will be the protection of the Bab al-Mandab, which their current troop, they see what's going on Periam Island would suggest is an aim. But the other question I was asked, what is the UAE's ultimate commitment to the STC? My guess is this is purely pragmatic. It's a useful organization at the moment. The UAE is not going to say it is opposed to Southern southern independence, though it's actually never publicly supported it. The STC remains the dominant power in and around Aden, which in terms of the south is where the population is concentrated, and it's influential along the coast and on Soqotra. Finally, on al-Mahra, the UAE was there until 2017, mid-2017, but pulled out because of strong local resistance to its attempts to create a security belt elite force model there. I think the UAE simply became just too unpopular in Mahra, and there was I think a deal at the time in late 2017 for the Saudis to take over, and of course the Saudis have deployed there in considerable numbers, in greater numbers than the other part of the south, ostensibly to cover smuggling, which was certainly true. Smuggling was a serious problem at the time, but that presence hasn't really diminished and remains there. And the signs are the Saudis have no early intention of leaving. I shall stop there.
Okay, thank you, Noel. Abdullah Baabood, please give us the view from Muscat, Oman.
From the view from Muscat is one as such that Muscat always believed that any instability in the region is going to affect its own stability and its own security. And it's always been working on ensuring that not only that there is stability and security in the region, but avoiding any kind of conflicts of any sorts in the region. And it also stems from the fact that Muscat is always trying to balance out the different players, as it were. In this case, the main players being Saudi Arabia and Iran, balancing them on one hand, but at the same time not taking any side on the other. So that is like one picture we could look at. The other one is that for Oman, Yemen is extremely important for many reasons. Of course, there is a historical reason. There was the war in the south. There is the socio-political relations, especially between Dhofar and Mahra. And we have tribes that kind of spill over between the two sides. Any instability in Yemen, especially in the south, could have ramification on the stability and security of Oman. And also, if you like, you want to add another reason to that. Oman always believed that conflicts are they're not avoided, they cannot be avoided, but they can be resolved through negotiations and dialogue and diplomatic means rather than wars and conflicts. So as far as the war in Yemen stands, Oman from day one was against the war, didn't participate with the Saudi-led coalition. In fact, from what I hear, that they have even advised against it. And since then, they kept trying to play a role of mediation between all sides, and it's open its borders to all sides of the Yemeni parties to come. And Oman hosted, of course, the Houthis, but also even the STC and the Hadi government people are all in Oman. I was in Muscat, and I saw some of them almost living in hotels next to each other, and they were having lunch with each other and talking at the same time. So it created like a venue for them to to even talk and mingle with each other and exchange views. But not only that, Oman offered its services, like a venue for other parties as well involved in the conflict, like the Saudis and as well as the Iranians, to come and talk to all the parties in Muscat. And now we are seeing even the Americans, and we've seen, of course, the Tim Lender King, flying visits to Muscat and meeting with the Houthis. So it has facilitated to a certain extent this kind of dialogue. To what extent this is going to be successful, one doesn't know, because obviously there are so many ramifications to this conflict, and there are so many parties involved and so many vested interests. But Oman is trying to kind of push for on that, in the direction of negotiations. Now, initially there was suspicions from the coalition that Oman did not stand with the coalition in the war, and also there were accusations that Oman has facilitated perhaps some smuggling through the border, which Oman obviously permanently deny. Whatever the case may be, one can never tell, because that border is quite porous and difficult to control, and smuggling takes place anyway, even before the war. Whatever the case may be, there were some tough moments, if you like, especially with the Saudis partners. They were, accusing Oman of, siding with the Houthi side, and Oman obviously denied all of that. What is interesting is that, there is, from what I hear, a Saudi delegation that's almost constantly living now in Oman, or staying in Oman, and talking to the Houthis, and also to all the parties. I don't think this is public, and I don't know if you want to cut this off, but this is what I heard from some of the people there. And obviously, the recent visits by Linder King, and also by Martin Griffiths and so on, has shown how that Oman's role and its mediation role has been very useful to the Saudis, and they have welcomed the Omani role and applauded it in a way in their announcement. And I think the same thing came from the US government as well. Appreciated what Oman is doing in terms of bringing the parties together, and at least making space for them, and giving them an opportunity where they can talk. Now, Oman had also been a little bit apprehensive in the beginning with the military operation, especially in al-Mahra area, that Noel had mentioned, obviously for some good reasons. There is also, there has been a lot of investments from Oman that has gone to that area, because Oman has always suffered from insecurity in that part. And they have invested heavily, in terms of economic, but also social and political will, if you like, in al-Mahra area. And they don't want to see any instability there. So to see that, either the Emiratis or the Saudis moving in there initially raised fears, especially after hearing of the Gulf crisis, and after hearing, what has been muted as perhaps there was even a plan to overthrow the government in Qatar, and there was going to be a military intervention there of some sort. So Oman obviously feared that, and of course that goes back to, also the cooling down of the relationship with the Trump administration at the time, and the withdrawal from the JCPOA as well, and accusing Oman of being part of that, to the extent that Trump even refused to meet with the Omani delegation. He met all the GCC delegations during his visit to Riyadh, except Oman. So there were already some kind of apprehensions and fears from the Omani side. However, I think with the Biden administration now, and the way that the relationship has been building up, that fear of what's going to happen in al-Mahra area has dissipated. Oman is much more comfortable now, with the current government in the US and its policy towards, the region. And it seems that the Saudi-Omani relationship are actually warming up. to quite a large extent. And there are a lot of frequent visits, some of it announced, some of it is not announced, between the two countries, because I think Saudi Arabia now sees the value that Oman is placing and is doing. And I think Oman also sees that its relationship with Saudi Arabia is very extremely important. You know, it's strategic. It's a neighboring country. It's the largest in the Arabian Peninsula, and of course the largest within the GCC. And they don't want to have any acrimonious relationship with Saudi Arabia. And Oman is trying to kind of, you know, dissipate any kind of misunderstanding that took place in the beginning, especially under the current leadership, where, you know, we've had now change of the Sultan, but also change of the foreign minister and some of the officials. And I think the same thing will go with the UAE. So any fears of, you know, al-Mahra area that was actually there, it doesn't seem to be an issue now. And I think the main concern for Oman is to end this war, to end this conflict, and to have a peaceful end to it, and try and help Yemen to, you know, to come to peace with itself, and reconstruct, and helping in reconstructing the country, and meanwhile, you know, doing what it can in terms of helping the humanitarian situation in the country. If you want me to stop there.
Let's hear from Elana first, and then we'll come back for a wider discussion.
So I just have a couple of comments just as a reflection on what Jerry and Abdullah have said. So on the UAE, I would just add to, and sorry, Noel actually spoke on the UAE, getting mixed up. So I just have written down Noel in my notes. So responding to something Noel said, which is the just a bit about the UAE's present situation in Yemen. It's kind of interesting because they're pretty hands-off now. And to Jerry's question, which is what I was thinking about in the chat, where he basically says, and I think you're right, Jerry, if you don't mind me mentioning it, but you know, the UAE a lot of folks think the UAE strategy on Yemen has been part of a larger Red Sea strategy. And now they're sort of backing out of a Saab base in Eritrea, but as Noel rightly said, potentially building an airstrip or something or other in Param Island. So, you know, it's a little bit confusing what's going on there. The Soqotra story is really confusing. I'll be totally frank that I have been trying for years to get to the bottom of that, and I don't think I'll be able to until I go to Soqotra again. I have contacts in Soqotra. I have contacts on both sides of the situation in Soqotra, and I just can't quite get the what I trust to be the real story. And so I would just be very cautious of any media about Soqotra unless the person has literally been there and conducted dozens of interviews on the island. I would be very hesitant to believe anything that you read, either pro-UAE or anti-UAE. But the UAE is mostly hands-off on Yemen right now. And so that's not to say that I mean, everything Noel said about the UAE's role is absolutely correct in terms of building these forces in the south, in terms of supporting Tariq. They're still supporting Tariq, of course. They're still supporting the STC, but in a much more hands-off manner than before. And in ways that have led me to question exactly how much leverage they have, and it's always a question of how much leverage anybody has over Yemenis, as Noel knows. We always like to think it's 100%, right? Because it's such an easy narrative, like, oh, the UAE can just tell the STC to do X, Y, Z. And it just actually doesn't really work that way. And so, but there is some amount of leverage. So the question is just kind of where on the scale is it? And by backing away from the conflict, the UAE has protected itself from Western narratives about its involvement and all sorts of things, but it also gives up some of that leverage when they're, for example, no longer paying salaries to the security belt folks on the ground, things like that. So and now Anwar Gargash has left his position, and these two people have come in to replace him. And it's a little bit unclear right now who is really in command of Yemen policy in the UAE, just because we're in this kind of transition in the foreign ministry. So of course, Reem al-Hashimi does work on Yemen, but more kind of on the humanitarian side. So I think there's some shuffling around in the UAE, and they're just less hands-on than before. And they also have always been very cautious about being too close to the Saudis in Yemen. So when the Saudis operated in one place, the UAE operated in another. They never operated in tandem. And that was intentional because their militaries are not similarly trained. So and so now the UAE claims to be entirely focused solely on counterterrorism in Yemen, and also in supporting Tariq, but there's lots of rumors about UAE support for other things, and exactly what are they doing with the STC these days. The UAE says the STC is helpful with counterterrorism, but that's really our only aim, and it's just a little bit unclear and harder to get an answer now that they're just not talking about Yemen as much. So anyway, so those are my comments on the UAE. And then just one quick comment on Oman. I think Abdullah made a really great point about how the Omanis really welcome everybody. So the way that I describe Oman, and the way it's been described to me, is that if brother and sister are fighting, then brother and sister are welcome to come to my house to stay until the fight blows over. But what becomes awkward is when brother says, I'll come stay with you, then sister suddenly feels like she can't. So, then it gives the impression that, Oman is taking brother's side when Oman is saying, no, both of you are welcome, right? And so to make that a realistic analogy, Oman has said everyone's welcome to come to Oman, but the reality is the groups that aren't already in Saudi or the UAE are the ones who went to Oman. So then it looks like all the groups that are anti-UAE and anti-Saudi are in Oman, i.e. Oman is anti-UAE, anti-Saudi, which is not how Oman would characterize itself. So I think Abdullah's point that there are Islahis and some STC and some Hadi government, that there's people from other parties in Oman, and there certainly have been in the past. The STC, the Al-Baid family was in Oman for a long time. So I just think that that's a really critical sort of nuance to understand. And then I would also just add that Oman was very critical in the GCC initiative in 2011, and I just have always wondered if we can have a GCC initiative too. And it would be a very different document. Like we could have a whole day conversation about what that looks like. But I just think Oman really likes the construct of the GCC. And I think that they could potentially push for something like that if we could figure out, or Yemenis could figure out what a GCC initiative 2 actually means. Like, what does the document actually say? But just conceptually, I think that they would like that sort of collective arrangement, looking like the region is supporting Yemen. Anyway, Jerry may have some other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Jerry, but let me say Alex raised his hand, so let me give first right of questioning to Alex. But I'd also like to have Abdullah come back in. Abdullah, I didn't hear you say what is the Omani view of the Riyadh Agreement and what position the leadership in Muscat took on that. But please, Alex Vatanka, ask your question.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll be very quick. And actually, my question was really along these lines for Abdullah. Abdullah, could you see, and perhaps give us a little bit of history of any possible Omani role in bringing the Saudis and the Iranians together on Yemen or anything? I'm just curious, what's the latest, if there is anything, and maybe a bit of history in terms of what Muscat has been able to do over the years, along the lines of what Oman has done in US-Iran kind of context.
I think Oman does not stop in terms of, trying to offer its services to all the countries in the region to talk and have dialogue. Even, during the Shah's time, for example, if you want to go back to history, Oman invited the Shah of Iran and invited other GCC states, and also they at that time was talking about maybe a security arrangement that included Iran at the time and Iraq. That obviously did not go any further, but the concept itself led to the GCC at the end, which was kind of very limited and excluded both Iran and Iraq and Yemen, unfortunately, in to some extent, if you like. It would have been great to have all the countries in the region, even if they were not part of the core, but at least to have some kind of a forum for them to talk and to have a dialogue and to cooperate and build, do some confidence building measures as well as economic cooperation. During the Iran-Iraq war, Oman has always been, extremely helpful in trying to open its, its services and offer its services to, end the war and dialogue between both, Iran and Iraq, and also involved the Saudis. So it had always played some kind of a role. The Omani's policy is always kind of vague and very quiet, and their diplomacy is not something that that they go and shout about, or it's not in the media. And some of these meetings even take place without us being knowledgeable about, or the media being knowledgeable about. But I think they're always been trying to do that. I think at some point there was a fatigue, perhaps, that was Omani diplomacy has reached, especially with with the fact that they could not see that Iran and Saudi Arabia are going to talk with each other. And obviously, maybe there were some very old people in the ministry, or people who just got tired of this. And now we have a new leadership in Oman, not only for the country, but also in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and some young people who work with him. And I think they are trying to reinvigorate that. But to what extent, I don't know, because Oman is not known for, country with very major initiatives. If you like, it's just very easy, simple, subdued, if you like, way of doing things. So just trying to reconcile and negotiate and mediate, but not to take major initiative in that front. I hope I answered that one way or the other. But in your question, Stephen, was Oman welcomed the Riyadh announcement, and I think this is also goes to what I was trying to say earlier, that Oman is trying to mend any kind of misunderstanding or mend the relationship with Saudi Arabia and overcome any misunderstanding with Saudi Arabia. So it obviously welcomed the Riyadh Agreement, and there were there were questions that always are raised whether Oman actually supports the STC or supports the separation of north-south of Yemen. If you look at it from maybe a strategic viewpoint, Oman maybe could benefit from having Yemen divided and having two smaller countries, or at least a smaller country, its neighbor, than a very large country like Yemen. But at the same time, Oman does not want to interfere in this. They see themselves, this is not our decision. This is entirely a Yemeni internal domestic issue. They have to decide on this. If they decide they want to separate, we will support them. If they decide they want to be together, we will support them. But we are not going to take a position on Yemen. We support a united Yemen as it is now. But if the Yemenis decided at the end they want to separate, that is their own decision. But Oman will support whatever the outcome of a Yemeni reconciliation. They are not trying to take position. That's very Omani kind of policy.